All right, close your eyes for a second. Just picture Tudor England, right? Castles, knights, maybe Anne Boleyn, that whole deal.
Yeah, the usual suspects.
But are you picturing, like, a black trumpeter right there in the heart of Henry VIII's court?
Not the image we usually get, is it?
Nope, not really. But history, as we know, loves to throw us a curveball. And today, well, we're diving into one of those curveballs. A deep dive into the world of Black Tudors.
Real people living real lives and honestly challenging everything we think we know about Tudor England.
Exactly. We're going beyond the usual history books, the ones that paint the past and just black and white. Get ready to meet the Black Tudors.
And we're not just making this up as we go along, you know.
We've got receipts.
We've got parish records, tax documents, legal battles, even diaries and letters that offer a glimpse into their personal lives.
It's like a historical puzzle.
Yeah.
And we're putting the pieces together.
And trust me, this isn't just some boring academic exercise. These stories are full of life, intrigue, and characters that, honestly, would probably make Shakespeare do a double take.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
We're talking social climbers, artisans, even a diver who explored the wreck of the Mary Rose.
And these people weren't just there in the background. They were actively shaping the Tudor world.
Their stories make us think differently about race, identity, and honestly the whole fabric of English society in that iconic period.
Buckle up, because by the end of this deep dive, you're going to see Tudor England in a whole new light.
A way more diverse and honestly way more complex picture than what we usually think of.
Who knows? Maybe it'll even inspire you to do some digging of your own. Uncover some hidden histories in your own backyard.
Okay, so let's kick things off with I guess you could say, the rock star of Black Tudors, the man who basically put them on the map.
John Blank.
John Blank, a trumpeter in Henry VIII's court, and we actually have a picture of him in the Westminster Tournament roll from 1511.
And he's not just some random face in the crowd. We can actually trace him through all sorts of records, like his pay slips, clothing purchases, and get this, even a kind of a cheeky petition he sent to the king asking for a raise.
Wait, a petition for a raise? That's pretty bold.
Yeah.
Tell me more about this guy's audacity. What was he thinking?
I think it really shows his confidence, you know, and also his position at court. Remember, this is Henry VII, not exactly known for being super chill with, you know, employees who asked for more money. But here's John Blank basically saying, hey, King, I'm good at my job and I deserve to be paid accordingly.
So did he get his raise? I mean, you don't get the title of most famous Black Tudor without some serious negotiating skills, right?
Well, the historical record isn't totally clear on that, unfortunately, but we do know that he kept working in the court for years, even played at Henry VII's funeral, and then again at Henry VIII's coronation.
Wow, talk about career longevity. I also read that Henry VIII actually gave him a pretty fancy wedding outfit as a gift, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Imagine a doublet made of black velvet, which was super expensive at the time, paired with violet cloth, a color that was usually reserved for, like, royalty and stuff.
This guy was definitely not just any ordinary trumpeter. John Blank was clearly a big deal at court.
Absolutely.
But here's where things get a little more complicated. There might have been another John Blank.
Yeah, that's always the historian's dilemma, isn't it? People back then loved to reuse names.
Makes things a little confusing.
It does make tracing individual lives pretty tricky. So yeah, there might have been multiple John Blankas in the records, each with their own story to tell.
So we've got at least one, maybe two John Blanks.
Mm-hmm.
But there's this idea out there that Tudor England was, like, totally white.
Right, a very monochromatic view of history.
So what's the deal with that?
It really shows how much our assumptions can shape how we see the past. For ages, historians and everyone really kind of believed that. They didn't really look for or pay attention to the evidence that contradicted that idea.
And I'm guessing the lack of, like, visual representation didn't help either, right? It's like out of sight, out of mind kind of thing.
Exactly. We're so used to seeing history depicted in a certain way that we can miss the diversity that was actually there. It's what we call the tyranny of images. Those limited portrayals shape our perceptions, and we end up with this skewed version of the past.
Okay, so if the all-white Tudor England picture is wrong, how many Black people were actually there? Can we put a number on it?
That's the million-dollar question. But getting an exact number is really hard. Record keeping wasn't always consistent, and lots of people, especially if they weren't wealthy or powerful, just wouldn't have left a paper trail.
But the fact that we have any records of Black people from this period is pretty significant, right?
Totally. Each name, each story we uncover, it chips away at that old narrative and forces us to see Tudor society as the complex thing it actually was.
All right, so John Blank might be the poster child for Black Tudors, but he's definitely not the only one with a story to tell. Let's meet some of these other interesting characters. I'm really intrigued by Jack Francis, the diver who explored the Mary Rose. That sounds like something out of a movie.
Oh, it's an amazing story. Think about the skill and courage it took to dive back then, retrieving cannons from the bottom of the sea. And some accounts even suggest he may have been enslaved before he came to England.
Really? Enslaved? Wow, is there any evidence to back that up?
Tough to say for sure. Historical sources can be tricky, and sometimes we just have little pieces of information to work with. It's what makes doing this kind of research so challenging, but also so rewarding.
Speaking of piecing things together, what about the lives of Black women in Tudor England? Are there any stories that shed light on their experiences?
Sadly, the records are even more fragmented when it comes to women, especially Black women. But there are a few intriguing glimpses into their lives. One such figure is Mary Phyllis.
Mary Phyllis, what a great name. What do we know about her?
Well, she was baptized in London at age 20, which was in 1597. But what's interesting is she'd been living in London for years before that.
Hmm, that's curious. Why the delay? What was going on there?
That's a great question. Was it a personal choice, maybe societal pressure, or possibly a requirement before she could get married? We just don't know.
A marriage, huh? Sounds intriguing. Tell me more about Mary Phyllis's life. Was marriage the only option for Black women back then?
Well, we know that Mary Phyllis also worked as a seamstress, so it seems like she had a trade, some independence, which challenges that stereotype of Black women being limited to domestic work.
A working woman in Tudor England. I love it. Sounds like she was determined to make her own way in a world that didn't always make it easy, especially for a Black woman.
Absolutely. Even though we only have bits and pieces of her story, it hints at a wider range of experiences and possibilities for Black women during this period.
So we're seeing Black Tudors working in the royal court, diving for treasure, pursuing trades. It's definitely not the limited view we often get. But what about slavery? Was that happening in England at the time?
It's a bit of a complicated question. While the transatlantic slave trade was growing, slavery itself wasn't officially allowed in England. However, there were definitely some gray areas, legally speaking.
Ooh, legal gray areas. Now you've got me really interested. Tell me more about that.
There's this case of Hector Nunes, a Portuguese man who tried to claim ownership of an Ethiopian man in London. His case failed in the end, but it shows how tricky it was to enforce enslavement within the English legal system at that time.
So even back then, people were pushing back against slavery. It wasn't just widely accepted.
Exactly. There's a famous ruling from 1569 that actually said, the air of England is too pure for slaves to breathe. Now, this ruling wasn't legally binding or anything, but it shows that more and more people were starting to oppose the idea of slavery on English soil.
Pretty powerful statement for that time. Okay, so slavery was a murky issue in Tudor England. What about racism? Do we see evidence of those attitudes popping up?
It's really hard to untangle the emergence of racism from those evolving ideas about slavery, and the historical records we have don't always give us a clear picture.
Can you give me an example of that lack of clarity?
Sure. Think about Edward Swarthy. He was a black porter. There's a record of him actually whipping John Guy, who was a white man, and, importantly, of a higher social status. What's interesting is that the account focuses mostly on the fact that Swarthy was lower status and dared to challenge someone above him, not really about race.
So the focus wasn't necessarily on Swarthy being Black, but on him challenging the social order. Makes you wonder if the concept of race, as we think of it today, was even fully formed back then.
It's a really interesting question that historians are still debating.
All this talk about historical language and interpretation reminds me of something we mentioned earlier, the whole black man thing, sometimes referring to clothing, not race.
Ah, yes, the joys of interpreting historical language. A term that seems straightforward, like black man, could mean several things depending on the situation. It might refer to a man of African descent, sure, but it could also just mean a man wearing black clothes.
So we can't just assume we understand these old documents through our modern lens.
Exactly. We need to look at these sources carefully, consider the little nuances of the language, the social dynamics, and the bigger historical picture.
It's like being a history detective, sifting through clues, building a story that's both compelling and makes us really think.
And sometimes those clues take us down some pretty unexpected paths, revealing things that completely change how we see the past.
Well, my brain is definitely working overtime right now. But before we keep going with these amazing stories, let's take a quick break.
Sounds good. Before the break, we were talking about how tricky it can be to understand historical language, especially when it comes to race. But it's also fascinating that even with those challenges, we see how people's views on the slave trade were changing, even as it was, growing.
Ooh, changing views. Tell me more.
So around 1620, there was this English merchant named Richard Jobson. He was in Gambia.
Right in the thick of it, huh?
Exactly, right where the slave trade was booming. And he was offered the chance to buy enslaved African women.
Wow, he was right there at the heart of it all.
He was, and here's the thing, he refused. He wrote that he did not exchange any that have our own shapes.
Wait, hold on. That's pretty remarkable for a merchant back then, isn't it? What do you think that means?
It suggests that even as the slave trade was gaining momentum, some people were really wrestling with the morality of it, recognizing a shared humanity with the people being trafficked. Jobson's refusal really challenges that idea that everyone back then just saw Africans as inferior and deserving of enslavement.
It's amazing how just one sentence, one act of defiance can offer such a profound look into how complex the past really was.
Absolutely. And as we get into more of these individual stories, we start to see that simple explanations don't cut it. We need
Right.
to embrace the nuance to really understand history.
Speaking of nuanced stories, I want to hear more about Mary Phyllis, the seamstress we talked about before. She seems like a real trailblazer.
Oh, she was. But as often happens with women in the historical record, what we know about her life is, well, pretty limited. But we can still learn a lot from what we do have.
Like putting together a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
Looking for those missing pieces to complete the picture.
Right. So what we know is that she ended up moving to a more modest household, working for a seamstress named Millicent Porter. This suggests maybe she was looking for an apprenticeship, a way to improve her skills and have a more independent life.
Wow, that's so cool. It shows how ambitious she was, how resourceful, how determined to make her own way in a society that often put limits on women.
It definitely challenges those stereotypes we often see about Black women in that era.
I'm curious, are there records of other Black Tudors doing skilled trades, like having professions? We talked about John Blake being a musician, of course, but are there other examples?
Oh, absolutely. We have this intriguing case of reasonable Black man, though, as we talked about before, whether that was his actual name, well, who knows.
Right, gotta love those old records.
But we do know that he was a silk weaver.
Silk weaving, that's pretty impressive. That must have taken a lot of skill.
It would have. And it suggests he was a part of the local economy, not just relegated to menial labor, like some might assume.
It's fascinating to picture these individuals living in a world that was still being shaped, you know?
Yeah.
The slave trade was getting bigger, ideas
Yeah.
about race were still forming, and yet here they are, building lives, working, making their mark on history.
And that's what makes these hidden histories so powerful. They force us to really question what we think we know, to appreciate how complicated the past was, and to recognize the contributions of people who have been, kind of forgotten.
Makes you wonder how many other stories are out there just waiting to be discovered.
Exactly. It reminds us that history is a never-ending journey of discovery.
Speaking of exciting discoveries, before the break you mentioned the guy named Diego who sailed around the world with Francis Drake. That sounds like an epic adventure.
Oh, it is a remarkable story, and it shows not only how diverse the experiences of Black Tudors were, but also how connected Tudor England was to the rest of the world. We often think of Tudor England as being kind of isolated, but Diego's journey shows that it was part of a much larger world.
Okay, so how did Diego end up sailing with Drake? What's his story?
Well, they met for the first time in Panama in 1572. Diego was part of a community of Maroons.
Maroons, who were they?
They were escaped slaves who had created their own settlements, often in remote areas.
Wait, escaped slaves building their own communities, resisting recapture? That's incredible. It totally goes against that idea of enslaved people being passive.
Absolutely. Resistance took many forms, and the Maroons are a powerful example of that.
Okay, so Diego meets Drake, joins his crew, and then they sail around the world. This sounds like something out of a movie.
It was quite a journey, and it really highlights those global connections of Tudor England.
So what happened to Diego? Did he make it back?
Sadly, he didn't. He died from arrow wounds in Indonesia during the voyage. But even though his story was tragically cut short, it speaks to the incredible courage and resilience of these individuals. They were navigating a world full of danger and uncertainty.
It reminds us that history isn't just about kings and queens and battles. It's about the everyday lives of, regular people, their struggles, their triumphs, the impact they had.
And sometimes those regular people lived extraordinary lives.
Like they say, well-behaved women seldom make history. That applies to Black Tudors, too. They were breaking barriers, challenging the norm, and making history.
And it's our job as people who love history to unearth those stories, to make sure they're not forgotten.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, exploring the lives of Black Tudors in the court, at sea, and in their communities. We've touched on the complexities of slavery and racism. But before we wrap up, I want to talk about something we mentioned earlier. Those racist images in literature and travel writing from that time.
Ah, yes, a tough topic, but an important one to discuss.
It is uncomfortable, but I think it's crucial to acknowledge that these harmful stereotypes, they were there, even back then.
I agree. We can't shy away from the uncomfortable parts of history. It's important to recognize that these racist tropes and images weren't just words. They had real consequences. They shaped how people saw each other and contributed to discrimination.
So how do we make sense of that? On one hand, we see Black individuals achieving success, getting recognized, and on the other hand, we see these dehumanizing stereotypes being spread around. Seems contradictory.
It's a reminder that history is messy, never just black and white. Progress and prejudice can exist side by side, even in the same society.
Like a tapestry, right? You've got those beautiful threads, and then those darker ones all woven together.
Exactly. And by looking at those darker threads, by understanding where these racist and prejudiced ideas came from, we can appreciate even more the achievements of the people who overcame those obstacles.
It's about recognizing their resilience, their strength.
And learning from the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them.
Right, history isn't just about the past. It's about creating a better future.
Well said. And I think it's time we get back to those individual stories. We've got more ground to cover. All right, we've gone from the royal court to the ocean depths and met some pretty amazing Black Tudors along the way. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a little challenge.
Ooh, a challenge. I like it. What do you got in mind?
Well, we've been talking about all these remarkable individuals, John Blank, Jack Francis, Diego, Edward Swarthy, Mary Phyllis, and so many others. For a long time, their stories were practically lost, buried under all these assumptions and forgotten narratives.
Yeah, and yet there they were, just waiting for someone to piece it all together.
Exactly. So here's the challenge. Think about the stories that really resonated with you today. Whose story really sparked your curiosity? What questions are you left with?
Yeah, don't let those questions just fade away.
Become a history detective. Dive into those archives, explore online resources, visit museums, historical sites. There's a whole world of hidden history out there, just waiting for someone with a curious mind to uncover it.
You never know what you might find. Maybe you'll stumble upon a document that's been forgotten for centuries, or a clue that unlocks a whole new chapter in someone's life.
Or maybe you'll connect different pieces of information and create a narrative that completely changes how we understand the past.
And hey, who knows? Maybe someday we'll be deep diving into your discoveries right here on the show.
That's the amazing thing about being a history enthusiast. You're not just passively listening, you're actively shaping the story.
You're a part of a conversation that spans across time, connecting us to the past and helping us understand the present.
So keep asking those questions, keep exploring, keep challenging those traditional narratives. History is vast and ever-changing, and there are endless stories waiting to be told.
Well said. I think it's time to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. But before we go, I want to emphasize one last thing. The stories we've explored today, the lives of these Black Tudors, they're not just footnotes. They're integral to the fabric of English society.
They challenge our assumptions and enrich our understanding of the past.
Absolutely. Their stories remind us that history is never simple, never one-sided. It's a tapestry woven from the experiences of people from all walks of life, from every corner of the world.
And by recognizing their contributions, by celebrating their achievements, by acknowledging the challenges they faced, we gain a much richer understanding of history as a whole.
A more complete picture, right?
Exactly. And that deeper understanding can help us create a better future, a more just future, one that values every single person.
Beautifully said. Well, on that note, a huge thank you to our listeners for joining us on this incredible journey into the world of Black Tudors. We'll be back soon with another fascinating deep dive, more hidden corners of history to explore. Until then, keep exploring.